I was waiting at Terminal 3 for my parents, anticipating a quiet weekend. Instead, I saw my husband, Christopher. He had told me he was negotiating supplier inventory 3 states away. Yet there he stood by the arrivals hall, kissing a woman in a leather jacket with practiced intimacy. Drop a comment and let me know where you are listening from and what time it is for you right now. I would love to know who is part of our community. Also, if you have ever caught someone in a lie this big, I want to hear it below. My father, Richard, stood directly behind me in the arrivals hall. He anchored his hand heavily on my shoulder, providing a steady physical weight against the sudden, catastrophic collapse of my perceived reality. I did not cry. I did not scream or demand answers. Anger was not loud this time. It was entirely clinical. I held my iced coffee, the plastic crinkling sharply under my rigid grip as the ice shifted inside. I simply watched them. I watched Christopher dote on this stranger, Kayla, with a tender, focused devotion he had not shown me in 4 long years. The betrayal was absolute, a complete and unmitigated breach of our marital contract, but my reaction was strictly surgical. I rubbed my eyes, attempting to summon some predictable wave of despair, panic, or heartbreak, but there was only cold clarity. This was not an emotional breakdown. It was a sudden, glaring balance sheet, and we were heavily in the red. We turned and left the terminal in complete silence. My father is a man who spent his life auditing the city's most corrupt corporate officials. He does not deal in emotions. He deals in ledgers, liabilities, and concrete evidence. Walking to the concrete parking garage, he did not offer empty platitudes or fatherly pity. He offered a definitive strategy. "We do not need a messy scandal," he whispered as he unlocked the car, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "We need a precise, calculated strike." I nodded, sliding into the passenger seat and closing the door with a solid thud. There was no hesitation in my chest. The marriage had been effectively terminated at exactly 11:51. By 12:03, as we merged onto the highway, I was already calculating the complex logistics of the liquidation. I pulled out my phone and began securing my personal accounts, changing passwords with the methodical precision of a senior accountant closing out a disastrous fiscal year. Christopher mistakenly thought he had simply stepped outside the acceptable bounds of our marriage for a weekend affair. He did not realize he had just triggered a hostile, relentless takeover of his entire life. For years, I'd been the silent, reliable investor in his manufactured version of a family, blindly funding his extravagant lifestyle while he exclusively enjoyed the returns. I was so blinded by his performance that I had delegated our financial oversight to his trusted accountant, foolishly believing we were building our foundation together. Now I realized our love had merely been a subscription service, with me footing the entirety of the bill. It was time to cancel the service permanently. My father started the engine, his expression unreadable, but his intention perfectly clear to anyone who knew him. We were going to dismantle Christopher's carefully constructed existence piece by piece, brick by brick. We drove back to my downtown condo in strict silence, the rhythmic hum of the highway serving as a metronome for the comprehensive audit that was about to begin. I refused to let sadness cloud my judgment. This was not about revenge. Revenge is sloppy, unpredictable, and highly emotional. This was accounting, and Christopher's fraudulent books were about to be audited with merciless, unforgiving precision. I looked out the window at the passing city skyline, feeling a cold, decisive power settling deep into my bones. He had freely made his choice, and now he was going to pay the invoice in full. We returned to the condo and immediately began the systematic autopsy of my marriage. The large oak dining room table became our dedicated war room. My father and I spread out years of bank statements, tax returns, and dense investment portfolios across the wood surface. As we cross-referenced the accounts, tracing every dollar and cent, the cold, undeniable truth emerged from the numbers. I realized I was never actually a valued partner in this marriage. I was a credibility shield. I had spent years tirelessly fueling his luxury real estate business with my 6-figure salary as a senior creative director. I provided the stable, unblemished professional reputation he desperately needed to secure commercial loans and impress skeptical investors. Sociologically, predators in the financial and corporate world rarely choose weak or dependent partners. They intentionally target successful, legitimate, high-achieving individuals. They do not marry for love or companionship. They marry for impenetrable cover. They ruthlessly use their partner's stellar credit score, flawless public reputation, and steady, high-yield income as a legitimate mask to disguise their own fraudulent, high-risk activities. My legitimacy made him look legitimate to the banks. My hard work provided the perfect camouflage he needed to systematically drain our joint accounts without raising a single red flag. I methodically catalogued every financial discrepancy he had meticulously hidden over the past 48 months. There were undocumented wire transfers to offshore accounts that made absolutely no business sense. There were massive cash withdrawals falsely disguised as independent contractor payments for properties that did not exist. There were revolving credit lines opened strictly in my name, leveraged to the absolute maximum limit. It was an intricate, devastating web of theft, all hidden behind the polished veneer of a successful development firm and a supposedly happy, thriving marriage. I looked at the cascading numbers, tracking the aggressive flow of capital out of our shared, secure life and directly into his secret, illicit one. I did not feel heartbroken or betrayed. I felt exactly like a forensic auditor uncovering a massive multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. Every forged signature, every hidden debt, every fabricated lie was simply another data point to be logged and weaponized. My father sat across from me, his reading glasses perched low on his nose, highlighting glaring discrepancies with a bright yellow marker. We worked straight through the night, fueled by black coffee and cold determination, methodically documenting every single act of financial treason. By dawn, the grim picture was entirely complete. Christopher had built his fragile empire entirely on my back. He had used my pristine credit history to acquire risky bridge loans for commercial properties he could never afford on his own merit. He was a financial parasite, quietly feeding off my hard-earned stability to fund his illicit affairs and stroke his massive ego. They were not going to be shocked by what they had done. They were going to be utterly shocked that I had stopped playing along. I gathered the highlighted bank statements and placed them in a neat, organised and damning folder. The evidence was irrefutable. The marriage was just a hollow shell company for his ego, and I had been the unwitting board of directors. But the exhaustive audit was now complete, and the final findings were catastrophic. I was fully prepared to freeze his assets. Christopher returned from his fabricated business trip exactly 3 days later. He walked through the front door, projecting the vibrant, triumphant aura of a man who had just single-handedly closed a major deal. He dropped his expensive designer leather duffel bag in the foyer and immediately launched into his practice pitch. He did not ask how my weekend was. He did not kiss my cheek or offer a greeting. He went straight to the transaction. He needed to leverage our primary condo for a massive bridge loan to cover a sudden, unexpected shortfall on his newest luxury development project. He paced the living room, exuding effortless charm in his tailored suit, speaking rapidly about manufactured future deals and guaranteed high-yield returns. He was the quintessential performance husband. The pathology of the performance husband is fascinating and deeply toxic. It relies entirely on maintaining the massive gap between perceived wealth and actual reality. These men intentionally project an image of overwhelming, limitless success, driving leased luxury cars and wearing $20,000 watches, specifically to create an illusion of financial invincibility. They speak loudly in vague business buzzwords, constantly alluding to massive deals just on the horizon to keep everyone hooked. This performance is a highly calculated psychological strategy designed to blind their partners, friends, and investors to the fact that they are deeply leveraged and essentially bankrupt. They trade aggressively on false confidence because they possess absolutely no actual capital. I sat perfectly still on the sofa, watching him perform this elaborate, desperate financial theatre. I coldly analysed the glaring difference between his projected wealth and the grim, documented reality currently sitting in the audit folder on my desk. It was deeply, immensely satisfying, a quiet, soaring intellectual superiority that completely overrode any lingering marital affection I might have possessed. I knew exactly how close he was to total, irrecoverable collapse. He placed a thick stack of complex loan documents on the glass coffee table and handed me an expensive pen, pressuring me to sign away my hard-earned equity. "It is just a standard formality, Lauren," he said smoothly, flashing his trademark practice smile. "The capital will be freed up in exactly 30 days. You will not even notice it is gone." I looked down at the dense documents. I immediately saw the predatory interest rates. I saw the buried fine print that would leave me solely legally responsible when his empty shell companies inevitably defaulted. Because my credit score was the primary anchor for these loans, the bank treated the fraudulent signatures as my own obligation, effectively holding me hostage for his debts until I could prove the criminal forgery. He was completely blissfully unaware that the game was already over. I picked up the pen and held it lightly between my fingers, letting the heavy silence stretch across the room. I played the role of the hesitant but ultimately compliant wife to absolute perfection. I asked a few basic, naive questions, allowing him to explain away the massive risks with his usual charming condescension. Then I casually mentioned that I needed my corporate lawyer to review the terms before I could sign anything related to our primary residence. His confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second. A brief telling flash of panic disrupted his flawless performance. He quickly recovered, assuring me there was no time for lawyers, that the lucrative deal would fall through if we did not move immediately. I remained completely composed. I told him the answer was definitively no. The transition from supportive wife to unyielding business partner was seamless. He stared at me, entirely unaccustomed to hearing the word no. He tried to argue, tried to manipulate, but I simply stood up and walked away. The trap was locked. Over the next 2 weeks, I flawlessly executed the role of the oblivious, supportive wife. I meticulously made his morning espresso, picked up his dry cleaning without complaint, and listened to his increasingly frantic phone calls with polite, practiced detachment. Behind the scenes, however, the retaliation was operating at maximum ruthless efficiency. It was a grueling performance, but it was the only way to keep him complacent while I closed the final loops on the financial evidence. Every cup of coffee I served was a reminder of the price he would soon pay. I directed the audit, leveraging my father's veteran network of retired corporate forensic accountants to ensure the forensic rigor was absolute. We did not need to actively destroy his companies. We simply needed to expose them to the unforgiving light of day. We quietly and methodically leaked the true, unvarnished risk profile of Christopher's development firm to his primary investors and his lending banks. We forwarded the precise, damning ledgers showing his highly leveraged properties, his mounting hidden debts, and the deeply disturbing lack of liquid capital. We did not break his business. We simply allowed it to fail entirely on its own merits. Without the powerful illusion of my financial stability and pristine credit backing him, his entire fragile house of cards began to collapse. The fallout was swift, brutal, and clinically beautiful. I sat calmly at the kitchen island, sipping my green tea, and watched him sweat through his expensive shirts. His phone rang constantly, a relentless chorus of impending doom. First, his primary angel investor pulled out of the massive downtown luxury loft project, citing sudden, severe concerns over asset liquidity. Exactly 2 days later, his primary bank abruptly froze his commercial lines of credit pending an emergency internal review. Once the red flags were raised regarding his inconsistent revenue reports, the bank's automated risk management systems triggered an immediate freeze, rendering his entire operation insolvent overnight. He paced the hardwood floors of our condo, his custom suit suddenly looking slightly too large on his rapidly shrinking frame. He was actively hemorrhaging capital, and he had absolutely no idea why the bleeding would not stop. He cursed the banks, he blamed the fluctuating market, he screamed viciously at his contractors. He never once suspected that the silent architect of his absolute destruction was pouring his coffee and smiling politely at him from across the kitchen counter. I watched his manufactured arrogance dissolve into pure, unadulterated financial panic. The power reversal was absolute and intoxicating. This was the raw accounting process in action. I was balancing the scales, zeroing out his fraudulent accounts, and completely liquidating his ego. Every time a new catastrophic disaster struck his firm, I offered bland corporate-style sympathy. That is highly unfortunate about the bridge loan falling through, I would say smoothly, not missing a beat. Perhaps you should reassess your risk management protocols. He was far too panicked to notice the cold, transactional nature of my carefully chosen language. He was drowning in his own fraudulent choices, and I was the one who had quietly, efficiently removed the life raft. His mistress, Kayla, was undoubtedly wondering why the luxury dinners, weekend getaways, and expensive gifts had suddenly and inexplicably stopped. The funds he usually embezzled from our joint accounts to shower on her were now completely locked down. I had rerouted my direct deposits, severed his access to my credit cards, and initiated a quiet, legally binding freeze on our shared investment portfolios. He was financially isolated, suffocating under the crushing weight of his own liabilities. The silent audit had successfully neutralized his business operations. But the final, lethal blow was yet to come. The forensic investigation yielded the final, undeniable kill shot on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. My father walked into the living room and handed me a thick, spiral-bound dossier outlining the complex offshore transfers. The revelation was staggering, even for someone who had spent the last month swimming in his lies. The woman from the airport terminal, the mistress in the leather jacket, was not just a casual affair partner. He had manipulated Kayla into serving as the nominee director of K&C Holdings, essentially a legal shield for his fraudulent activities while he maintained total shadow control. She was officially listed as the primary director of K&C Holdings, a highly discreet shell company incorporated in a remote, tax-sheltered jurisdiction. Christopher had been using this hidden entity to systematically, illegally funnel massive development funds away from our legitimate joint ventures and directly into our absolute control. This was no longer a simple, painful case of infidelity. This was organized, premeditated financial fraud on a massive scale. I turned the crisp pages of the dossier, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted bank records and forged corporate resolutions. Christopher had actually falsified my signature on multiple commercial loan documents to authorize the immediate transfer of massive capital to K&C Holdings. The sheer unmitigated audacity of the crime was breathtaking. He had fully weaponized my legal identity to fund his mistress's shadow corporation. The adultery was a deep personal wound, a complete breach of our marital contract, but the staggering fraud was a guaranteed federal prison sentence. I stared at the forged signatures, tracing the familiar loops and lines of my own name written by the man who claimed to love me. I did not feel a single ounce of rage. I felt an absolute, icy, overwhelming triumph. I had everything I needed to legally and permanently incinerate his entire existence. The complex equation was now perfectly, beautifully balanced. He had tried to steal my future, so I was going to systematically dismantle his... I closed the heavy dossier and locked it securely inside my leather briefcase. I had spent the last exhausting month quietly untangling my vast assets from his, securing my own capital, and meticulously preparing for this exact moment. The long preparation phase was finally over. It was time for the execution of judgment. I called my corporate lawyer and scheduled an emergency meeting for the very next morning. We drafted the final, devastating documents, prepared the extensive criminal referrals for the authorities, and finalized the divorce petition. We finalized our legal strategy and served the initial wave of filings, ensuring the criminal fraud investigation was formally underway. He had treated our marriage as a disposable asset, a simple tool to be leveraged and casually discarded when convenient. Now, he was about to discover the severe, life-altering penalties for corporate malfeasance. The mistress, Kayla, would also be facing intense federal scrutiny for her active role as the director of a fraudulent shell company. They had actively colluded to steal my capital, and now they would equally share the massive liability. I drove back to the condo that evening, feeling significantly lighter than I had in years. The crushing burden of his lies had been lifted, replaced by the cold, hard, unyielding certainty of the truth. I walked into the kitchen, placed my briefcase on the marble island, and waited. Christopher walked into the kitchen at exactly 7 o'clock that evening, completely oblivious to his impending ruin. He stopped dead in his tracks. My father, my mother, and my corporate attorney were seated in a strict, silent row on the opposite side of the long marble island. I stood at the head of the counter, my hands resting lightly on the cool granite surface. Christopher immediately attempted to deploy his usual frantic defensive scripts. He projected loud indignation, asking why my parents were here, demanding to know what this ridiculous, dramatic ambush was about. I did not engage with his desperate theatrics. I simply slid the heavy, spiral-bound audit folder across the smooth marble. It stopped exactly 1 inch from his hand. I did not shout. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of emotion. I spoke with the clinical, merciless precision of a prosecuting attorney reading a comprehensive list of federal charges. I calmly listed the exact number of offshore wire transfers. I detailed the illegal incorporation of K&C Holdings. I explicitly named his mistress Kayla as the primary director of the shell company. I handed him high-resolution, undeniable copies of the loan documents bearing my expertly forged signatures. His meticulously manufactured arrogance evaporated instantly. The colour rapidly drained from his face, leaving him looking incredibly hollow, small, and entirely ordinary. He opened his mouth to deny it, to spin another desperate lie, but the irrefutable, crushing weight of the documentation strangled the words in his throat. He looked at the printed ledgers, at the forged signatures, and finally realised that he was completely, utterly ruined. The confrontation lasted less than 12 highly efficient minutes. It was swift, brutal, and entirely legal. We left him standing alone in the kitchen, staring silently at the undeniable blueprints of his own destruction. The aftermath was a masterclass in swift, unforgiving justice. Within a year of our initial legal filings, Christopher was forced into complete personal bankruptcy. His luxury development firm collapsed entirely under the massive weight of the numerous fraud investigations. Kayla was formally and delicately to flee intense, relentless federal scrutiny for her active role in the Shell Corporation, her luxury lifestyle abruptly and permanently terminated by sweeping asset freezes. I retained full unencumbered ownership of the downtown condo and successfully recovered the stolen capital through highly aggressive civil litigation. I did not seek to destroy him purely for the sake of emotional destruction. This is the auditor's mercy. True power is recognizing that order, structure, and legal justice are always vastly superior to chaos and petty, screaming revenge. I did not scream or break his possessions because his pathetic actions did not warrant my valuable emotional expenditure. I simply enforced the strict rules, balanced the ledger, and allowed the severe consequences of his own calculated fraud to execute his punishment. By remaining cold, detached, and methodical, I preserved my dignity and completely secured my financial future. I have come to realize that true loyalty must first be to the unvarnished truth and to your own tangible assets. You simply cannot build a solid foundation on someone else's fragile illusions. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it is the only logical way to set yourself free from their toxic liabilities. Do not wait for a financial predator to miraculously change their behavior. Build a life and a career so secure, so structurally sound, that you can simply walk away when the ugly truth is finally revealed. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And I want to know, what is the one boundary you wish you had set sooner? Let us talk in the comments.